There's a statistic that should make you put your phone down. In 1971, 61% of Americans lived in middle-class households. Today, that number is 51%, 10 percentage points, over 50 years. And before you say, okay, that's not that bad, understand that those people didn't move up because the upper class only grew by 4%, which means the other 6%, they fell down. And the lower income tier has been absorbing people like a slow leak in a boat that everyone agrees is definitely not sinking. This is the story of how the middle class, the thing that made America the most powerful consumer economy in human history, is being quietly, systematically, and almost surgically removed from the equation. Not through one dramatic crash, not through one bad policy, but through 5 interlocking mechanisms running simultaneously. Mechanisms so normalized that most people living through them don't even have a word for what's happening to them. So let's give them one. Let's start with the first mechanism, and it's the one hiding in plain sight inside every grocery store, every utility bill, and every coffee you've bought in the last 3 years. Shrinkflation. You know the bit. The bag of chips that's now 30% air by design. The toilet paper roll with a wider cardboard tube. The orange juice carton that went from 64 ounces to 52 without changing the price. These aren't accidents. They're a coordinated, deliberate extraction strategy. And it has a name. Economists call it a non-linear price increase. Companies call it value engineering. Normal people call it getting ripped off in slow motion. Here are the numbers. Since 2019, the average American grocery bill has increased by over 25%. But real wages adjusted for inflation, have grown by roughly 4% in the same period. Do that math and you realize the average household is running a deficit on basic survival expenses they've been running for years. Not because they bought a boat, not because they made bad investments, but because the cost of existing went up faster than the reward for working. And the reason companies do this so confidently is because they know the middle class will absorb it. They'll cut a vacation, not renew a subscription, switch from brand to store label. They'll adapt. They always adapt, which is exactly why it keeps happening. Because the middle class isn't just an income bracket, it's the economy's shock absorber. And every time it absorbs a shock, the companies that caused it book it as a win. Which brings us to the second mechanism, and this one is slower, quieter, and significantly more damaging than a bag of chips. It's the homeownership trap. For most of the 20th century, homeownership was the primary wealth-building tool of the middle class. You bought a house, you lived in it, it appreciated, and when you retired, you had an asset worth more than you paid for it. Simple, effective. The foundation of generational wealth for tens of millions of families. Then, 2 things happened simultaneously and broke the entire system. First, institutional investors discovered residential real estate. BlackRock, Invitation Homes, American Homes. 4. Rent these firms and others have collectively purchased hundreds of thousands of single-family homes in the last 15 years. In some metro markets, institutional investors purchased 20 to 30% of available homes in a single quarter. In Phoenix in 2022, investors bought 1 in every 4 homes sold. They didn't buy them to live in, they bought them to rent out at whatever the market would bear, which, because they now controlled a meaningful percentage of supply in those markets, they could dictate. Second, interest rates went from near zero to over 7% in less than 18 months, the fastest rate hiking cycle in modern history, which means someone who could afford a mortgage in 2021 at 3% suddenly couldn't afford the same house at 7% because the monthly payment nearly doubled on them. They didn't become less qualified. The math changed on them in real time. The result is a generation of middle-class earners trapped in a rent cycle they cannot escape. They're paying someone else's mortgage, building someone else's equity, and the gap between renting and owning has never been wider. The median home price in the United States is now approximately 7 times the median household income. The historical norm was 3 to 4 times. That gap doesn't close gradually. It closes in one direction, with one event, and that event is a crash, which doesn't help renters either. Because when the housing market crashes, lending tightens, and the people who couldn't buy before definitely can't buy then. The homeownership ladder didn't get harder to climb, it got pulled up. The third mechanism is the one that Wall Street economists love to explain away with charts, and the one that anybody who's ever worked a salaried job knows is completely real. It's productivity decoupling. From 1948 to 1979, worker productivity and worker compensation grew almost in lockstep. You produced more, you earned more. The relationship was almost linear. That relationship ended in 1980 and has never been restored. Since 1979, productivity in the United States has increased by over 60%. Compensation, actual wages for actual workers, has increased by roughly 18%. That gap is not a rounding error. It is the single most important number in understanding where the middle class went, because someone captured the value of that productivity gap. It wasn't the workers. Corporate profit margins hit a 7-0 year high in 2021 while real wages were declining. CEO to worker pay ratio in 1965 was 20-1. Today, it's over 350-1. The economy got more productive. It just stopped sharing. And the worst part? The middle class largely funded its own stagnation through 401 KS invested in the same index funds that own the companies paying them less. Through consumption of the same corporations extracting their purchasing power, the mechanism is elegant in a way that should genuinely disturb you. The middle class is both the customer and the product. The fourth mechanism is the one that gets called an education problem when it's actually a structural trap. It's the credential inflation spiral. In 1970, a high school diploma was sufficient for roughly 72% of middle-class jobs. Today, that number is closer to 35%. A college degree, which in 1970 was optional and affordable, is now essentially mandatory and costs $35,000 a year at a public university. The average student loan debt for a bachelor's degree is $37,000. For a graduate degree, it's $76,000. So the system told an entire generation, the price of entry to the middle class is a credential. Then it raised the price of that credential faster than inflation for 40 consecutive years. Then it made the debt non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, meaning it's the only debt in America you literally cannot escape, even if your entire financial life collapses. Then it told them they had no one to blame but themselves for the choices they made at 18 years old about which career to study. 43 million Americans are carrying student loan debt. Total outstanding student loan debt in the United States is approximately $1.7 trillion. That's not a debt burden. That's a tax on upward mobility that gets collected before the career even starts. The fifth mechanism is the one nobody wants to say out loud because it implicates everyone. It's the financialization of everything. In a healthy economy, finance is a service industry. It facilitates the movement of capital to productive uses. Companies grow, jobs get created, wealth is made by making things or providing services that people actually need. Finance skims a reasonable percentage off the top for facilitating this. That's not the economy we have. Since 1980, the financial sector's share of corporate profits has grown from roughly 10% to over 30%. Not because the economy got 30% more dependent on banking, but because financial instruments, derivatives, leveraged buyouts, share buybacks, options, synthetic assets became more profitable than the underlying businesses themselves. Making money from money became better business than making things from labor. Share buybacks alone, corporations buying their own stock to boost the price, totaled over $1.2 trillion in a single year in the United States recently. That's capital that didn't go to wages, didn't go to R&D, didn't go to new facilities or new hires. It went to goosing a stock price that primarily benefits executives with equity compensation and institutional investors with large positions. The middle class isn't just excluded from this system. It's the feedstock. Its spending is what generates the corporate revenues that get financialized into the instruments that generate the returns that concentrate the wealth at the top. It's a beautiful machine, just not beautiful for the people running it. Here's the gut punch. None of this required a conspiracy. No back room, no memo, no villain twirling his tie in a mahogany office. Each of these 5 mechanisms was individually rational. Companies rationally optimized for margins. Investors rationally purchased undervalued assets. Universities rationally raised prices to match demand. Financial firms rationally moved toward higher margin products. Each decision made complete sense in isolation. Aggregated across 50 years, they deleted a class. Which brings us back to that statistic from the opening. 51% of Americans in middle-class households, down from 61. The trend line doesn't improve from here, because the mechanisms are still running. The grocery bills are still climbing. The homes are still being purchased by funds. The wages are still decoupled from productivity. The credentials are still mandatory and still debt-financed, and the financial sector is still expanding. History is full of economies that hollowed out their middle class. It tends not to end quietly. And the one thing every version of this story has in common is that the people living through it convinced themselves it was a temporary setback, that the system would self-correct, that this time it was different. The 4 most expensive words in finance. Still true, still ignored. So here's where I want to hear from you. Because I've laid out 5 mechanisms and a 50-year trend line. And the question isn't whether it's happening, the data is the data. The question is, what comes next? Do you think this is A, a cycle that eventually corrects itself, like every previous economic contraction? B, a structural shift that requires policy intervention to reverse? Or C, already too far gone, and what we're watching is not a shrinking middle class, but the final chapter of one? Drop your take in the comments. I'll be reading through them.